Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Pardon me?
Do you mind if I do a couple of
That's alright. How do you get it up on there?
Just hit the
Oh,
ejector.
okay.
And this is still not work. Still doesn't work, huh? You should complain about that. What happens if
Yeah,
you
maybe
just
the
pick up this
battery's
phone?
weak.
Do you like to walk around when you talk?
I don't know. I should be alright. It's a pretty small room, so.
That's not very helpful then. 82212. Officially start yet, but let's kind of start. So I have two matters of business. First, we need to select class reps. This person in 213 and 313 will be in charge not only of attending the bi-semester, the two class rep meetings, but I'm also going to ask that you actually get back to me once a week with some sort of constructive criticism, at least. Possibly also something positive, but definitely something critical once a week, because that would be your job. So you'll email me once a week I'm going to pass around the roll sheet. And on the roll sheet, there's also a checkbox where you can check if you're willing to be a mentor for this course, which means this is not an official university program. This is just this course, which means out of the goodness of your own heart, if there's a student in your class who needs help writing or editing or proofreading, for example, students who don't speak English as a first language, or students who struggle to kind of formulate arguments, if you're willing to be a mentor for those students, check the box. And students, there will be some sort of awesome prize. I'm not really sure what it is. But I'd like to let you know that I do have the tablet. It's brand new in the box. So anyone who gets perfect attendance, and possibly those who also help mentor, will be eligible for the drawing for this brand new in the box tablet. Okay, so are there any questions about the course, about the kind of how we're handling things so far? Has everyone been able to read the readings? Is everyone prepared for tutorial? Great. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the time over to James Hallgrove, your fabulous DTA, and I've looked at his PowerPoint. It's been on 213 for the past few days, but I just barely uploaded it to the 313 Canvas website. So if you've been looking for that and haven't found it, sorry, it's my fault. I haven't. I didn't know it was there, so now I do. I downloaded it and put it back up on 313. So it's a much fancier and more exciting PowerPoint than I ever could have produced. So you are in for a treat. So I'll just turn the camera over for you.
Yep. How do I just get those lights off? Is it,
hit
is it this
lights
one
and hit teach. Or if you want it
Okay.
darker, you can do extra quality.
Okay, so I've just put up some suggested reading for you. I've had some people email me and ask for like extra reading, so there's some books for you that might help. So today there's 3 focus questions that I'd like to talk with you about. Now the first one we kind of covered on Friday already, what is meant by China's century of humiliation. Also, why was the Chinese Empire militarily defeated so many times throughout the 19th century? So today we're going to be looking at the external threats that China faced. Okay? So Friday we covered domestic problems, civil wars, rebellions, uprisings. Today we'll be looking at wars against foreign nations that China went through. Okay? And to what extent did defeat at the hands of the Western powers hasten the decline of the Qing dynasty? Okay, by 1911, the Qing dynasty had collapsed. Why did it get to this point? Okay, so ready to move on? Okay, so we did talk a bit about this on Friday. What is this place? Does anyone know? Yep.
The residence of the foreign guest of the emperor?
Not really. Yep.
Is it the Summer Palace?
Yeah, it's the Summer Palace. Okay, so Yuanming Yuan, which we talked about on Friday. Does anyone know what happened to it?
Got looted
Yeah, it did. It got looted. When did it get looted?
during the Boxer
A
intervention.
little bit earlier than the Boxer Rebellion. Anyone else know? So? Yeah, 1860. So what conflict was going on and who looted it? Yeah. The Second Opium War, yep, that's right. Who was it looted by?
British.
Yeah, the British and the French troops who were advancing on Beijing. So there's a historian called James Heavier who said it's a deliberate act of humiliation. It was an object lesson for others who might contemplate defying British power. Okay, now, these ruins have been left as they were, okay, just as they were back in 1860. Why might the government today just choose to leave them like this?
Reinforced nationalism.
Yep, good. Okay, has anyone been to Yuanming Yuan before? It's quite an impressive site. I recommend you go there if you get the chance. Okay. So what is humiliation? Okay, it's an essential part of the founding mythology of the People's Republic of China. Okay, I'll read a bit slower. Sorry. So I think it's a pretty good name for a period in which unprecedented disaster befell the Chinese Empire. Okay, and it really began with the British victory in the First Opium War of 1839 to 42. So in the official nationalist curriculum of modern-day China, okay, this century only ended when Mao stood atop Beijing's Tiananmen Gate and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, okay, in 1949. Okay, so in the Chinese official nationalist historiography, the century of humiliation kind of runs like this. China had long been the world's superpower, okay, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it started to fall behind. Okay, it fell behind because Western nations like Britain and the United States and France, okay, went through their industrial revolutions. Okay. China, however, lacked the superior technology of the West, okay, which contributed towards Chinese defeat in the Opium Wars and subsequent wars too. Okay, so after that, a series of wars, occupations, revolutions, and complete collapse, nearly, of central authority occurred. Okay, and this didn't end until the communist victory in 1949. Okay. Now, if you go onto that link, I won't open it now, but in your spare time, if you go onto that link, you'll see about how, Chinese diplomats, Chinese politicians, they bring up the memory of the century of humiliation all the time. Okay, in any territorial disputes they have, like with the stuff about the South China Sea, okay, they'll bring up the century of humiliation. Okay, ready to move on? Okay, so remember back to last lecture when you heard about how the Chinese Empire had been the biggest and the best. It was the most awesome with all the best technology and all the coolest stuff. Okay. The Chinese Empire was reluctant to allow trade with the Westerners. Okay. And in 1757, they closed all but one port, okay, the city of Guangzhou. Okay. So if you wanted to go and sell your stuff in China or buy stuff from the Chinese, you had to go to Guangzhou to do it. Okay, so this is what's known as the Canton system. Okay, Canton is what the Westerners knew as called Guangzhou back in the 19th century. And it placed some heavy restrictions around what the foreign merchants could and could not do. Okay, so if you wanted to go and live in Guangzhou and sell your things, you had to go and live on a tiny little island called Shamian Island, which is a little island on the river in the middle of Guangzhou. And there some Westerners set up their factories and warehouses to sell their things and buy things. Okay, if you go to Guangzhou today, you can still actually wander around there and see it. It's pretty cool. What else? So all their trading had to be supervised by what was known to Westerners as the Kohong, okay, what was known in Chinese as the Gonghang. There was a guild of Chinese merchants, so they basically audited everything that you did and made sure you weren't doing anything illegal like selling drugs or alcohol. Also, you had to leave during the winter, so you could only trade with the Chinese during the summer months. So most of the foreigners would go to Macau, which was under Portuguese control. Okay, so foreigners didn't much like this setup. The balance was in favour of the Chinese. Okay, they could control what went on and who did what and who sold what and who bought what. Okay, but there wasn't much the Westerners could do about it yet. Okay. So, late 18th century. Okay, China's still the preeminent power in the region, but there was a new global power on the rise. Okay, Great Britain. And the British were expanding their trade links, establishing industrial and economic dominance, setting up colonies all around the world. They were, the new sort of global superpower. China was a bit of a problem for them, however. So at this time, there was a big growth in the British consumerist class. Okay, people wanted to start buying things from China. Okay, why do you think the British like drinking tea so much? Okay, where does tea come from?
India.
Yeah, some from India. Where does most of it come from? China. Okay. The British really got hooked on tea. Okay, and they really, people wanted to start buying it. Other things that they wanted were things like silk, porcelain, artworks, furniture. If you go to any sort of middle class home in London back in the 19th century, you could expect their sitting room to be full of Chinese furniture. So Chinese manufacturers getting rich, selling things to the British, okay, and other Europeans too. Okay, but unfortunately for the British, they didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted. So the government felt the need to try and reverse this, okay, open the trade, okay, make it more accessible, allow the British to start selling things. So they sent this guy up here, this guy on my left, Lord Macartney, okay, in 1794. Okay, he was a respected British diplomat, and he travelled all the way to the imperial court in Beijing to ask the Qianlong Emperor to please open some more trading ports, okay, allow people to buy and sell whatever they want any time of year, and also establish formal diplomatic relations, okay, between Britain and China. Now this failed. Okay, there were a variety of reasons. Now most historians say it was because Macartney would not kowtow to the emperor. Now what does it mean to kowtow? Bow. It's more than just a bow though. What do you have to do? Yeah, you have to get down on the floor and touch your head on the floor.
Who in this room has kowtowed before? Raise your hand.
Does anyone want to give us a demonstration? Okay, so Macartney refused to do it. Okay, kowtowing before the emperor was a way of saying the King of England is, the servant of the Chinese emperor. He wasn't going to do it. So what do you think the Chinese emperor said to him? Anyone know? Yep.
He wrote this really, really long and patronising letter back.
Yep, he wrote a really long letter to King George III in England saying, we don't want any of your stuff. We've got lots of stuff. Why would we want any of yours? Okay. He also asked Macartney to please go away. Okay, so he had to leave the country. Also in 1816, the Amherst Embassy, okay, led by Lord Amherst, he also refused to kowtow, and it didn't go down too well. The Chinese emperor was not going to establish diplomatic relations and recognise any other foreign king as his equal. Okay, King George III of England was, in his eyes, a barbarian ruler of a foreign country. Okay, he wasn't going to acknowledge him as his equal. The Qianlong Emperor was the Lord of the world. He was the Son of Heaven. Okay. Okay, so by the end of the 18th century, however, China was in trouble. As you heard on Friday, they had some good times during Qianlong's long reign. But by the end of the century, it was starting to unravel a bit. Okay, Qianlong was getting a bit old and losing his touch. Too many people. The Qing government couldn't, work out how to feed them all. Okay, they just were doing things too efficiently, so people were living longer, having better lives. So if you look on this map here, you'll see the extent of the Qing Empire in the 18th century. Okay, it's pretty big. corruption among elites and local officials. Okay, Qianlong was starting to lose, control of his empire. Also at this time, European traders were starting to arrive in larger numbers, and the Chinese government couldn't really figure out a way to deal with them effectively. Okay, for reasons I'll get to a bit later. Okay, so rapid expansion in the 18th century, military success, linguistic, the neighbours were being affected by China's linguistic and cultural exports. Okay, so things were going well for China, okay, until the turn of the century when things started to unravel. Okay, now my master's thesis is on the Opium Wars, so because I've got a bit of a soft spot for that, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about opium and what it meant. So, what is opium? It's a drug. Okay, and what better way to try to reverse this trade imbalance than selling drugs to the Chinese? So, it's a drug that's extracted from the poppy flower, okay, which is something that British and Chinese societies had used for a long time by the beginning of the 19th century. They'd used it for medicinal purposes. Okay, it was good if you had a headache or a toothache or something like that. If you couldn't sleep, okay, it's a good way to get to sleep. Okay, now this here is what's known as laudanum. Okay, the British would mix opium with alcohol and drink it, and that would help you get to sleep. Okay, it's a good way to relax as well if you're feeling stressed after getting home from work after a long day. Oh, what have I done? Okay, so just some other things they'd use opium for. If your child is not cooperating, not going to sleep at night, okay, this is what's called infant doping. Okay, so you could go, it was perfectly legal, you could buy it over the counter. Okay, and you could go and dope your baby with opium so it would sleep through the night. Mum gets a bit sick of having to get up 3 times a night to feed the kid. So, give it some opium, make it sleep. Okay? Now, opium was there was also a romantic side to it. Okay, who's heard of Thomas de Quincey? He's a famous British author. Well, not many people have heard of him though. Okay? Okay, now in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which is was a really well-known book for its time, he would talk about how great opium was, okay, and it allowed him an escape. Now he was an opium addict, okay, and he'd take opium and have all these great hallucinations about all these adventures to the Far East and India and Egypt and all these other places he'd go on. Okay, so British people would read this, okay, and think, oh, opium's not so bad after all. Okay, let's move on. So where did the British grow most of their opium? Yeah. Pardon?
India.
India, good. So whereabouts in India? If you have a look at this map. Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
Near
part of the north,
Pakistan.
not quite though.
Pakistan, Afghanistan.
Yeah, opium would get grown there, but where did the British grow most of their opium?
East.
Yeah, so it was in Bengal, which is this region here. So not tall enough. Okay? So the pink parts of India show the bits that were controlled by the British. Okay? Now they didn't control it directly. They had a company known as the British East India Company. Okay? That way the government could say, hey, we're not involved with growing opium, it's this corporation that's doing it, not us. Okay? And there were these huge fields of opium, okay, of poppies. Okay? Huge, as far as the eye can see. That they would grow the opium and then load it onto big ships and transport it to China. Okay? So see how they load it on in Calcutta, down the bottom of Singapore, and up into Guangzhou. Okay. So the opium trade really started to take off. Okay. The British East India Company had a monopoly, a trading monopoly on all trade with China. Okay, or all British trade with China, I should say. Okay, so you couldn't go and act independently. Okay, you had to go through the East India Company, which made, by the 1830s, millions and millions of pounds. Okay, which was very useful for keeping the British administration in India going. Okay, where was I? Okay, so there's one historian called Carl Trockey, I should know his name. Okay, and he described the British Empire at this time as a global drug cartel. Okay, think of like the Colombian drug rackets and them. Okay, he thinks it's not too much different. So by the 1830s, millions and millions of pounds worth of opium from British India was being sold in Guangzhou. Oh, well, yeah, I'll just show you these pictures. So this just shows the extent of some of the, this is just a small part of the opium trade. Okay, this is a big warehouse in India. Okay. Okay, so sale of opium it really took off. Like, look at 1750, for example, 600 chests being sold. Okay, by 1790, it had gone up to 4,054. Now, if we fast forward a bit to 1828, okay, 13,000, over 13,000 chests of opium. Okay, and by 1832, 23,000. Okay, so the problems were made even worse. Okay, the British government decided to abolish the East India Company's trading monopoly, which meant anyone could come in and sell opium whatever price they wanted. So if they wanted to undercut the East India Company and sell it at a lower price, okay, that's probably good for business. And this contributed towards a real serious domestic crisis, okay, which the Chinese government didn't really have any answers as yet. Okay, they were slowly being bankrupted. Okay, opium addiction was so rampant by the mid-1830s, people were buying it up and money was just flowing out of the country. Now, they also had a problem with local officials. Many of them were actually also opium merchants, okay, which makes it very difficult when the government's trying to crack down on opium when your local officials are actually, buying it and selling it. Okay, and here's a map just showing, how the opium got into China. Now, most of it came through Guangzhou, which is here. Okay, and then it went all along the rivers up this way. So, yeah, as I said before, abolition of the company's monopoly. Okay. Now, the Chinese government, they did try their best to suppress the opium trade. Okay, it was illegal in China. So the British government decided to send a resident to Guangzhou to oversee trading activities and just smooth things over and make sure no one's going to start a war. Okay, this didn't go too well at first because they sent out a guy called Lord Napier. Okay, and he was very incompetent. He was also had shares in the opium trade. Okay, so probably not the best person to send out. He wanted to force China to open their doors and relax their trading rules. He also really hated that the British had to smuggle their opium into China. They had to do it in the middle of the night, okay, when no one could see. So he showed up to Guangzhou and he said to the local officials, look, you can't tell us what to do. The emperor's a Manchu anyway, so, he's a foreigner here. And the Chinese officials said no to him, so he took it as a personal insult. Now, there were a few British warships floating around just off the coast, and he decided to go to Macau and call them in to, really show the Chinese what for. So unfortunately for him, but fortunately for everyone else, he actually caught typhus on the way and he died. So, yeah, that was lucky. Okay, but it really embarrassed the British government. Okay, it made them look really stupid. So the next guy they sent out was a guy called Sir Charles Eliot. Okay, he was a bit smarter than Napier. He didn't like opium that much, but he didn't really have the authority to control it. So he would tell the merchants sometimes, please don't do that, but usually he would sit back and do very little. Okay. Now in Beijing, there was an intensive debate in the imperial court, okay, how to deal with this crisis. Okay, opium addiction was a real problem. They had to deal with it somehow. Now there was a very conservative sort of lobby group, if you want to use that term, called the Spring Purification Party. Okay, and the Daoguang Emperor, he sympathised with them. Okay, he wanted to purge China of all its opium. Okay, and he also... where's my notes gone? Okay, and he also passed a decree saying, any opium smugglers, whether they're Chinese or foreign, will be executed, okay, if they get caught. So Daoguang sent this official called Lin Zexu down to Guangzhou to deal with it. And the reason he chose him is because his nickname was the Incorruptible. Okay, it was kind of hard to find people who were not corrupt at that time in the Chinese government. So he sent this guy down because he knew that he wouldn't be swayed by the temptations of opium or the temptations of making money. Okay, and his job was to get rid of the opium trade. Okay, so he went down and he sacked a whole lot of the local officials who'd been complicit in the trade. Okay, he closed down a whole lot of opium dens. He executed a few people, within sight of the British factories in Guangzhou. And he also asked Eliot to get the merchants to hand over all the opium that they had in the city. Okay, there were several £1 million worth of opium in British warehouses at the time, and he uses a whole lot of Chinese troops to say, you will hand it over or we will kick you out of China. So Eliot said, okay, it's best that you just hand it over. What Lin did not tell Eliot was that he was going to destroy it. Okay, now, these are a few of my holiday snaps actually. This is the Opium War Museum. Okay, now it's in a town called Humin, which is an otherwise fairly uninteresting town, not too far away from Guangzhou. And they got all the opium together and poured it into these large pits. And then they poured salt and acid of lime into it and contaminated it. Okay, so you can still see those pits today. Now, the modern city's grown up all around it. But then once they've done that, they poured a whole lot of salt water into it and then got all the opium out, which was now pretty much useless, and threw it all into the river. Okay, so that was a real good way of showing the British, look, that enough is enough. Okay, we're not going to take it anymore. Yeah, so there we go. Now, Lin also wrote a long letter to Queen Victoria and basically told her how bad she was for allowing this to happen. Okay, it's got to this point where tensions are so high between British merchants and the Chinese government, and it's the British government's fault. And you're the Queen, you're the boss. You should be able to control them. Okay, so I'll read a little bit to you. We find your country is 60 or 70,000 li from China. Okay, yet there are barbarian ships that strive to come here for trade for the purpose of making a profit. Okay, the wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians. That is to say, the great profit made by the barbarians is all taken from the rightful share of China. Okay, by what right do they then, in return, use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Okay, even though the barbarians may not necessarily intend to do us harm, yet in coveting profit to an extreme, they have no regard for injuring others. Let us ask, where is your conscience? Of all that China exports to foreign countries, there is not a single thing which is not beneficial to people. Our celestial emperor lets tea, silk, and other goods be shipped without limit and circulated everywhere without begrudging it in the slightest. Okay, this is for no other reason but to share the benefit with the people of the whole world. Okay, the goods from China carried away by your country not only supply your own consumption and use, but also can be divided up and sold to other countries, producing a triple profit. Even if you do not sell opium, you still have this threefold profit. How can you bear to go further, selling products injurious to others in order to fulfill your insatiable desire? Now, it goes on longer than this. It's a really long letter. So I've given you the website as well if you want to go and read the whole thing. Okay, it's a pretty cool letter. Okay, he sasses her out. Okay, she doesn't reply, obviously. But it gets into the British newspapers and it becomes a bit of an embarrassment. Okay, so British merchants, okay, they'd lost a whole lot of money from this. Okay, after Lin went and destroyed all their opium, okay, they wrote home to the government in London saying, please reimburse us. And the British government said, no, we're not going to raise any new taxes. Okay, so the British government decided the best way to repay the merchants would be to get the Chinese to do it. Okay, and this became what's known as the First Opium War, okay, from 1839 to 42. Now, the traditional interpretation talks about the economics of it. It talks about an industrial, progressive, capitalist Great Britain, okay, versus a backward, irrational, Confucian China. Okay, so it's quite a condescending way of looking at it. Okay, saying, Britain is, advanced, the Chinese are backward. Okay, now my argument revolves around the fact that, the British were also questioning the use of opium. Okay, they didn't all 100% support it. Okay, but when this whole crisis started and, opium was chucked into the river, okay, they started talking about it as if it was property. Okay, the Chinese have stolen our legal property. Okay, and by doing this, they've insulted not only the British flag, but also the Queen, okay, the British government. Okay, so honour was at stake. Okay, and it became more than a war over opium. Okay, the British wanted free trade, diplomatic representation. Okay, they wanted China to treat them as an equal. Okay, so early on in the war, Elliot moved his merchants to Hong Kong, okay, and raised the British flag on Hong Kong Island. Okay, so that's a pretty important part of Chinese history. Think about the history of Hong Kong. British steamships sailed up the Yangtze River and shut down the Grand Canal. So all internal trade in China, more or less, was shut down. It was also a disaster for China. Okay? What they called the Chinese junks, which were like the wooden naval vessels, okay, they became practically useless. Okay, the British had steamships and industrial weapons. Okay, they could easily just blow them up. So, 1841, they tried to have negotiations, which failed. But by 1842, a complete Chinese military collapse. And the British had blockaded the entire coastline, more or less, and shut down all trade, okay, internal and external. And so China was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. Oh, I'll just show you some photos. Okay, so it was the Treaty of Nanking, which was Nanjing, okay, that's what the British called it back then. China was completely defeated. And in the treaty, the Chinese had to agree to hand over Hong Kong to the British in perpetuity, open some port cities to free trade. Okay, these include Guangzhou, Shanghai, Ningbo, Xiamen, Fuzhou. Okay, they became what were known as treaty ports. Okay, and they would stay like that for the next 100 years. Okay, so this is what's known as extraterritoriality. So a British person living in the designated part of the treaty port would be exempt from Chinese justice. So anything that he did that was a bit, okay, the Chinese couldn't do anything about it. He'd have to be tried back home in England. Okay. Now, a bit further on, this is the city of Shanghai. You can see two cities growing up side by side, a Western city and a Chinese city. Now, if you go to Shanghai these days, these two things are pretty much, as they were back then. Okay, a Western city, okay, centered around Shanghai Bund, and a Chinese city, okay, in the Shanghai Chinatown. Okay, as well as this, the Chinese had to pay a huge indemnity. Okay, not only to cover the costs of the destroyed opium, but also to help the British recover any costs that they had spent in pursuing the war.
James, just a note here. That indemnity still funds a ton of China research in Great Britain today. Lots of fellowships, scholarships, research on China, all this is funded by the Boxer indemnity.
Oh, really? Okay. So yeah, use it if you get the chance. So yeah, as I said before, Shanghai had its international settlement. Okay, British merchants could carry out their business. They could keep selling opium. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted, and they didn't have to worry about getting punished by the Chinese. Okay, and the French and the Americans would follow them, and soon they would open concessions in Shanghai as well. Okay. Now, has anyone been to Shanghai before? A few people. Okay, if you go there, you will still see some of the big British merchant buildings and warehouses. They're still there today. Okay, so for example, the Jardine Matheson building. Jardine Matheson was a big company that made its fortune out of selling opium. Okay, and they're still trading today. Oh, I won't go there yet. So what did this mean for China? Okay, the country had been forced to open up. Okay, they had to enter the international system. Okay, they didn't really want to, but they were forced to do it. And for the rest of the century, the Chinese kept trying to resist continued Western incursions. Okay, the Western powers would continually push for greater commercial privileges, and usually the Chinese would be forced to give way. Now, there was a second Opium War as well. Okay, China continued to resist, continued importation of opium. And in 1858, they boarded a British merchant ship called the Arrow. Okay, so you'll hear some historians refer to this war as the Arrow War. So they seized the opium and accused the owners of piracy. Now, the British were pretty annoyed about this. Their merchants didn't commit piracy. So this was the spark for the Second Opium War of 1858 to 1860. Now, this time, the British were even luckier. They had the French to help them out. And it did pause briefly in 1859, okay, when they forced the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Tianjin. Okay, this opened even more treaty ports. Okay, it set up British and French consulates in Beijing. Okay, the Chinese government, mostly they didn't like it. Okay, the Xianfeng Emperor actually was encouraged to keep fighting. Okay, now because he kept fighting and lost again, okay, the next treaty terms are even harsher. Okay, so as I said at the beginning of the lecture, the British and the French set fire to the Summer Palace, and there was a convention of Peking, or Beijing as it's now known. Okay, and the British extended their territory in Hong Kong. Okay, if anyone's been to Kowloon before, in Hong Kong, it's a place with the cool markets and the dodgy backpackers. Okay. Also, opium became legal in China. Okay, so China, defeated by the Western powers on a military level, also had a whole lot of further humiliations. Now, during the Second Opium War, The Taiping Rebellion was also going on. Okay, so domestic and external crises happening at the same time. So if you look at this list here, there's a whole lot of further humiliations. Okay, in 1884, for example, the Sino-French War. Okay, now for hundreds of years, China had been the dominant power in Vietnam. And as the French began to move into the region, they pushed China out. Okay, the first Sino-Japanese War. Okay, now this started with a squabble over Korea between China and Japan. Now Japan's quite an interesting case because earlier in the 19th century, you could draw some parallels with China. Okay, an inward-looking state which doesn't want to trade really. And now in 1868, the Japanese emperor was restored. Okay, and he decided to open Japan up and industrialize, try to copy the West. And as Japan became a more industrial power, they wanted things that the British and the French and the Americans had got. Okay, so they started to look over to China and think, okay, we could grab bits of it as well. Okay, so at the end of the war, which was a Japanese victory, China was forced to hand Taiwan over to Japan. Okay, Japan also got its own treaty ports in China. Okay, so they're trying to copy the West, be like the West. 1898, Germany occupied the city of Qingdao. Has anyone been to Qingdao? Now that's a cool city. You can go there and you can try the Tsingtao beer from the brewery. Okay, they also give it to you in a little plastic bag and you can walk around the city. Anyway. Okay, the Second Convention of Peking. Okay, the British gained control of the new territories in Hong Kong in a 99-year lease. It was a rent-free lease for the British for 99 years. Okay, other things that happened, Russian incursions into Manchuria during the mid to late 19th century. Okay, the Boxer Rebellion, as you heard about on Friday, okay, it was defeated by an 8-nation alliance, okay, 8 Western powers all ganging up on China to put down the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, and the British invasion of Tibet. So on this map, you can see all the different spheres of influence. Okay, the Western powers controlled, well, they didn't directly control, but they had influence over these vast areas of China. So up in the north, like Manchuria and Mongolia, okay, it was under Russian influence. Okay, even if you go there now, you can see cities with like Russian churches and things. Okay, the British around Guangzhou, Shanghai, Tibet. Okay, the French in the south, the Japanese, the Germans. Okay, so they all control, sort of semi-control, large parts of China. Okay, not under direct colonial control. Okay, but they're certainly telling the Chinese what to do. And now the Westerners produced some pretty cool cartoons as well. Okay, about what was happening to China. So let's talk about this one here. What's going on? Yeah, it's something to do with China. What's happening? Yeah.
They're showing the world powers carving up China.
Yeah. So it's from a French newspaper, and it said, China's being carved up like a melon. Which Western powers are doing it? Yeah.
Germany, France, Russia, and Japan and Britain.
Yep, good. So who's this one here? Yeah, it's Queen Victoria and the Queen of England. Who's this guy with the full moustache?
Kaiser Wilhelm
The second, yep. So the German emperor. Who's this one?
Nicholas II.
Yep. Okay. And who's this one here? Someone else want to say? Yep, that's the Japanese. And who's the woman on the right? France. Yep. Pardon me? Oh, sorry. Okay. And who's the guy at the top raising his hands? Does someone say it? Yeah. So that's the Chinese emperor. What's his reaction? He's annoyed, yeah. He might be saying like stop or something, but he can't really do anything about it. Yeah? Now, if you look on the right, there's a similar sort of idea. Like up in the north, the Russian bear is sort of walking over the north of China. Okay, you've got the French, the frog down the bottom, crawling up from the south. Okay, you've got the British walking around, the lion. Okay, so all sorts of bad things happening to China. Okay, what's going on in this cartoon? Does someone else want to tell me? Someone who hasn't said anything yet. Okay, so the lion and the bear, who are they? Yep, Britain and Russia, the two global superpowers of the age. What are they doing? Yep. Yep. So the dragon, which represents China, it's either dead or asleep or nearly dead. Okay. There's also the other powers, which are not quite so big but also important, sort of hanging around trying to get bits as well. So up on the left at the top, you've got like the American eagle. You've got the Germans hanging around, the French, the Japanese. Okay, all the other great powers trying to sort of grab bits of China for themselves. So, how was China at the end of the 19th century? Not in a good way, I would argue. Okay. So by 1900, what's happening? The imperial system has been discredited. Okay, it's suffered defeat, humiliation. Okay, it's militarily inferior. There's, the Western powers in Japan trying to grab bits of China for themselves, forcing China to do what they want, forcing China to trade when they don't really want to. Okay, it's an embarrassment for the Chinese government. Okay, China was bankrupted. Okay, there was a nearly complete breakdown of central authority. You heard about the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, it was not looking good for them. Now, somehow, it was just sort of held together by the Dowager Empress Cixi. Okay, I don't know how she did it, but she was a very, a powerful woman with great charisma. She was able to sort of hold it all together somehow. Okay, but she was very conservative, very inward-looking. She didn't want change. Okay, when the Boxer Rebellion started, she supported the Boxers. Okay, when the Guangxu Emperor suggested reform, she actually imprisoned him. She said, right, you can stay in the Forbidden City and never talk to anyone again. You can still be the emperor, but can't do anything. Okay, so very conservative imperial government. Okay, so it's quite different to, say, Japan, which was industrializing, trying to emulate the Western powers. Okay, the Chinese were looking backwards, trying to sort of, bring back the glory days of the 18th century. Okay, so there was some attempts at moderate reform. Okay, in the tutorials we'll be hearing about the self-strengthening movement. Okay, so that was a moderate attempt at reform, moderate way to try and emulate the West. Okay, there were more radical desires to get rid of the foreigners, like the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, so these moderate reformers had to come up against this very conservative system that didn't want change. Okay, the Dowager Empress was very much, keep things as they are. We'll get through this somehow. Okay, so yeah, I think that's about all I have for you today. Yeah, we'll be talking about the self-strengthening movement in tutorials. So, yeah, thank you and have a good day. Oh, it's an internet expression. Okay, thank you.
That was pretty
Was it good? Oh, I was so nervous. Yeah, I was like on the watch the whole time.
No, but I just
Melissa's does. She
if you
does
have
stuff
perfect
like
participation, then you get eligible for a free iPad, not iPad, tablet.